My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about what the United States will do with our friends and allies to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL. As Commander-in-Chief, my highest priority is the security of the American people. Over the last several years, we have consistently taken the fight to terrorists who threaten our country.
This is James Wright Foley, an American citizen of your country.
The news came as such a shock today. Philip Seymour Hoffman, the enormously talented Oscar-winning actor who made his name in Hollywood and in the theater, was found dead in his New York apartment at the age of just 46. But Hoffman had also been very public about his struggle with heroin. We knew he'd overcome an addiction years ago and spent more than 20 years counseling others not to pick up the habit of an ever more potent drug that's attracting all too many young people. In the end, though, it would appear he couldn't save himself.
Because of the tragic circumstances of Academy Award winner Philip Seymour Hoffman's death earlier this year, in relation to the purity and enormous availability of heroin, it's time to take a brief overview of the history and conditions that create the availability of this fatally dangerous drug. In 1843, intravenous injection was made possible with the appearance of the hypodermic syringe. Morphine was synthesized into heroin in 1874 by the Bayer Company of Germany. The word heroin was derived from the word heroic, since the drug was thought to be non-addictive and a cure for many everyday ailments, including addiction to cocaine and morphine. All prescription drugs were legal in the U.S. until the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 aimed to curtail drug abuse in patent medicines. In 1923, the U.S. Treasury Department Narcotics Division banned all legal sales of heroin, which retreated into the shadows of the black market and remained there until the 1960s, when it exploded into an epidemic with the advent of the Vietnam War. Heroin soon cascaded through the streets of America, with the assistance of drug-running elements of Air America under the guidance of the CIA. Under Ronald Reagan, government involvement in narcotics expanded and escalated to include cocaine, which became a substance of choice throughout America, even though heroin traffic remained steady. Generally, cocaine was not thought to be an addictive substance at that time, through the go-go 80s. Cocaine trafficking by the government was exposed by Pulitzer Prize-winning California journalist Gary Webb. Webb exposed it as a funding tool for clandestine government operations. Iran-Contra, led by Colonel Oliver North, was another narcotics-filled debacle. There were additional exposures of government involvement at Mena Airport, Arkansas, which showed continuing narcotics trafficking collusion between then-President George H.W. Bush and then-Governor Bill Clinton, and multiple-ton shipments of cocaine, weapons, and money laundering. In the late 90s, early 2000s, heroin became fashionable. Heroin chic was something to aspire to until the untimely death of young acting talent River Phoenix, who died unceremoniously of a heroin overdose in a night spot in Los Angeles called the Viper Room.
In a moment or two, I realize the sphere upon which I reside is asleep on its feet. Should I go back to sleep? Allegations of the U.S. government's involvement in the drug trade have often been labeled conspiracy theories, despite being reported by award-winning journalists and academics who investigated the claims, as well as former DEA, CIA, military, and police who witnessed, oversaw, or took part in the crimes. The government's ability and willingness to spy on people globally was similarly considered a conspiracy theory, until Edward Snowden recently disclosed this violation to the world. Also, like current whistleblowers, including Snowden and Bradley Manning, who are humiliated by the press and, in Manning's case, tortured in a U.S. prison before being convicted of 19 charges. Courageous individuals who speak out about the U.S. government's role in smuggling drugs and supporting drug lords are largely ridiculed and ignored. According to Alfred McCoy, historian and author, the U.S. government's management of the drug trade can be traced to World War II. He claims the CIA and other intelligence agencies facilitated the establishment of new hubs for opium production, heroin refining, and drug distribution in Southeast Asia after the suppression of the American and Turkish heroin trades. The U.S. government's control of the drug trade is also apparent in Afghanistan, where according to the United Nations Drug Control Program, opium cultivation increased 657% in 2002, which was shortly after the NATO occupation began. Afghanistan is currently the largest opium producer, accounting for 70% of the world's heroin supply last year. Nearly 900 tons of opium and 375 tons of heroin are trafficked from Afghanistan annually. Moreover, the number of people dying from heroin overdoses in NATO countries is actually higher than the number of soldiers killed in Afghanistan, which has not stopped U.S. military members from guarding the opium fields. Furthermore, in 2004, the Sinaloa cartel was found to be laundering money through one of the U.S.'s largest banks, Wachovia, which is now part of Wells Fargo. In 2010, the bank settled in court paying $110 million in forfeiture for allowing transactions connected to drug smuggling and $50 million for failing to monitor funds used to traffic 22 tons of cocaine. More importantly, Wachovia failed to apply proper anti-laundering regulations to $378.4 billion transferred to Mexican accounts. In the end, the total fine was less than 2% of the bank's $12.3 billion profits in 2009.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Do real time in jail in America for all kinds of ridiculous offenses, for taking up 2 subway seats in New York City. If you fall asleep in the subway, people go to jail for that all the time in this country. For having a marijuana stem in your pocket, there are 50,000 marijuana possession cases in New York City alone every year. And here we have a bank that laundered $800 million of drug money, and they can't find a way to put anybody in jail for that. That sends an incredible message, not just to the financial sector, but to everybody.
So let's talk about the other side, and I want to go to Attorney General Eric Holder. His remarks before the Senate Judiciary Committee last May, in which he suggests that some banks are just too big to jail.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large. Again, I'm not talking about HSBC. This is just a more general comment. I think it has an inhibiting influence or impact on our ability to bring resolutions that I think would be more appropriate.
That was Attorney General Eric Holder testifying before Congress. His remarks were widely criticized. This is federal Judge Jed Rakoff speaking last November at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
To a federal judge who takes an oath to apply the law equally to rich and poor, this excuse, sometimes labeled the too big to jail excuse, is frankly disturbing for what it says about the department's apparent disregard for equality under the law.
That's federal Judge Jed Rakoff. Matt Taibbi, if you could respond, and then talk about the history of Eric Holder, where he came from.
Well, first of all, this idea that some companies are too big to jail, it makes some sense in the abstract. In a vacuum, of course it makes sense. If you have a company, a storied company that may have existed for 100, 150 years that employs tens or maybe even 100,000 people, you may not want to criminally charge that company willy-nilly and wreck the company and cause lots of people to lose their jobs. But there are 2 problems with that line of thinking if you use it over and over and over again. One is that there's no reason you can't proceed against individuals in those companies. It's understandable to maybe not charge the company, but in the case of a company like HSBC, which admitted to laundering $850 million for a pair of Central and South American drug cartels, somebody has to go to jail in that case. If you're going to put people in jail for having a joint in their pocket or for slinging dime bags on the corner in a city street, you cannot let people who laundered $800 million for the worst drug offenders in the world walk.
Wait, this can't be a parenthetical. Explain what you're talking about with HSBC.
So HSBC, again, this is one of the world's largest banks. It's Europe's largest bank, and a few years ago they got caught, swept up for a variety of offenses, money laundering offenses, but one of them involved admitting that they had laundered $850 million for two drug cartels, one in Mexico and one in South America, and including the notorious Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico that is suspected in thousands of murders. And in that case, they paid a fine. They paid a $1.9 billion fine. And some of the executives had to defer their bonuses for a period of 5 years. Not give them up, defer them. But there were no individual consequences for any of the executives. Nobody had to pull money out of their own pockets for permanently. And nobody did a single day in jail in that case.
I want to turn to remarks by Lanny Breuer in 2012 about prosecuting large companies. At the time, he was the Assistant Attorney General. He spoke before the New York City Bar Association.
It's my duty to consider whether individual employees with no responsibility for or knowledge of misconduct committed by others in the same company are going to lose their livelihood if we indict the corporation. In large multinational companies, the jobs of tens of thousands of employees can literally be at stake. And in some cases, the health of an industry or the markets are a very real factor. Those are the kinds of considerations in white-collar cases that literally keep me up at night, and which must play a role in responsible enforcement.
That's Lanny Breuer in 2012, who was like number 2 in the Justice Department.
He was the head of the criminal division, so he's basically the top cop in America at the time.
He was at the Justice Department, of course. Eric Holder is the Attorney General, both from the same company. Respond to what he said and then talk about Covington and Burling.
First of all, that whole thing about the innocent white-collar employees perhaps losing their livelihoods, keeping him up at night. I want to know what his response is to, the idea that maybe a single mother on welfare is going to lose her kids. That would be the stuff that would keep me up at night. I mean, I wouldn't be worried about millionaire and billionaire executives who are working at these banks if I were Lanny Breuer. So that tells you a lot about the priorities of somebody like him.
And talk about Lanny Breuer, Eric Holder, where they come from, where they go back to.
So they both came from a law firm called Covington and Burling, which in the 2000s represented basically every single one of the too big to fail banks. They were also involved in the setting up of the electronic mortgage registry, so they played an enormous role in the subprime mortgage crisis.
These are not bad people. These are good people who are just taking advantage of rules that maybe they also wrote, but still.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And it's not something that is criminal. But even when it clears into an area that is so more clearly criminal, and I think the HSBC case is the great example of this. They admitted to laundering money for narco-terrorists.
Right. $850 million. They admitted
and they said, yes.
Yes. Oh, you got us. Yeah.
We did do that.
We did do that.
And their penalty was what?
They got a complete and total walk. It was a deferred prosecution agreement. Not one person did 1 day in jail. No individual had to pay any fines. There was a company fine of $1.9 billion, which was at the time a record. And that very same day when they made that announcement, and the Justice Department was very proud of that deal. Right. It wasn't like we didn't get any jail time for these guys. They were like, we got $1.9 billion. Aren't we awesome?
Right.
I went down to the courts that day and asked around. I said, "What's the dumbest drug case that you had today?" And they found a guy for me who had been caught walking in the street with a joint in his pocket, who got 47 days in Rikers. Now that's worse than anything that happened to anybody at HSBC, and they're at the top of the illegal drugs pyramid, and this guy's at the bottom, and he's doing a much more severe sentence. And that just can't be right. There's no way to look at that and have that be right.
No, and what I thought was very interesting about the book is you tie it through. This is systemic from the top, from the head legal authority in this country, Eric Holder at the Department of Justice, This is not a bug in the system. This is a feature of the system.
Right. That's exactly what it is. Eric Holder, way back in the Clinton years, when he was just a regular Justice Department official, he wrote this memo, and it's come to be known as the Holder Memo. And he outlined this policy, which is called the collateral consequences policy. And what that basically means is, if you're dealing with a big company that employs a lot of people, and if you prosecute it, bad things might happen to innocent people. You can seek other remedies. You can do fines, deferred prosecution agreements. You don't have to wreck the whole thing if you're going to do that.
Sure.
That's sensible, right? I mean, you don't want to destroy a company just because a few bad apples of the company, may have shredded.
Money laundered narco-terrorist money. Exactly.
Yeah. Or in the case of Enron, they might have shredded 2 tons of documents. But hey,
it happens.
It happens, right? Exactly.
No, you say it's a message that on that kid with a joint in his pocket. It says to him, "Go big or go home."
If you want to turn white powder narcotics from a raging torrent into a trickle, first you need the will. Then you need the people who are willing it to happen to stop. Those people are the elected and appointed officials of our government.
I seen the needle and the damage done, a little part of it in everyone. But every junkie's like a setting sun. I seen the needle and the damage done, a little part of it in everyone. Every junkie's like a setting sun.
After serving in a counter-drug unit, I've come up to realize a workable solution that could change the continuing tidal wave of narcotics traffic into a trickle. And it's not by catching individual mules with hockey bags full of drugs. The number one thing we need to do would be the re-regulation of American trucking. On September 11, 2001, American trucking was our first line of defense. Our border with Mexico continues to be the chief corridor for smugglers, just as Afghanistan continues to produce a huge percentage, 70 to 90%, of the heroin consumed by U.S. markets. Now, the NAFTA feature allowing trucking to come up unfettered through the American border has to be eliminated. There are basically 9 points of entry. The re-regulation of trucking will enable the U.S. government to track the source, transport, and delivery of all freight coming across by integrating the data of the dispatchers, drivers, and expediters of this trafficking. Together with this, the individuals of both the government and the financial institutions that allow this trafficking to happen, because they work hand in hand, should be handled as strictly as pedophiles are handled, with no bail status for financial signatories, for example. So if we instituted the re-regulation of trucking and a no loophole financial oversight with swift incarceration of the financial violators, we'll see this raging torrent evaporate to a trickle, and quickly.
These are the major facilitators of narcotics traffic. If you want to stop the major narcotics traffickers, these are the people who can stop it.